Are you saying that a lot of tools that get people hooked onto things like social media are the same, it's like the same, I guess, strategy to get hooked on a positive change in life?
Absolutely. That's the whole idea.
Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, totally. So we shouldn't use the psychology behind social media and what keeps us watching the news or different things. The same psychology that keeps us engaged and building habits around these oftentimes frivolous behaviors. We can use that very same psychology for good. And so the idea is that what I propose is this hooked model, which I developed by looking at all these various products and trying to see what's in common. And so we have this four basic steps that we see repeated time and time again throughout all sorts of habit forming products. Basically, the model is a trigger, an action, a reward, an investment. And it's through successive cycles through these hooks that our preferences are shaped, that our tastes are formed, and that these habits take hold. And so we see repeated time and time again these basic psychological principles. I'll just name one of them that's probably the engine of the hook model, which is called a variable reward. Variable rewards come from the work of B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. Back in the 1950s, he had these little boxes that he put a pigeon inside. Today, we call this a Skinner box. And he allowed these pigeons to learn that if they pecked at a disc, they would get a little reward. So peck the disc and get a little food pellet. And so very quickly, Skinner could train his pigeons to peck at the disc whenever they were hungry. And this is no big deal. If you have a pet at home, if you have a husband at home, you probably train them that if you do this, you get that, right? That's operant conditioning, no big deal. But then one day, Skinner walks into his lab and he realizes he doesn't have enough of these food pellets. He's run out and he doesn't have enough for the whole day. And so he can only afford to give it to the pigeons every once in a while. So sometimes when the pigeon pecks at the disc, they receive the reward, but other times they don't. And what Skinner observes to his amazement is that the rate of response, the number of times these pigeons pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. And so this really explains why we are so engaged with all kinds of forms of media that have an element of mystery, right? If you think about the news, why is it that people can't stop watching the news? We call them news junkies because the first three letters of news, N-E-W, is about what's new. It's around what's different. What do we not know? Nobody cares about last month's news. We care about what happened that we don't yet know, what's uncertain, what's variable, what's the mystery around what's going on. Think about what makes for a great book, what makes for a great movie. It's all about the unknowns, the mystery. Why do we love to play slot machines and gamble, right? Because there's games of chance. It's uncertainty. It's variability. Why do we love social media? Because that scrolling and scrolling and scrolling uses the exact same psychology as pulling on a slot machine. It's all about these variable rewards. And it's not necessarily bad or evil. It's that we can use that same psychology for all kinds of healthy behaviors. So when you use a language learning app or a fitness app or a personal finance tool or an enterprise software, the idea is that you want to build those products with the same exact psychology so that people want to use the product as opposed to feeling like they have to use the product.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It kind of taps into people's curiosity and need for something new. What is example of how you would apply that to like your own life, like creating variable rewards for yourself? Is that something that you can explain?
Hooked is really for product makers. It's how to build habit forming products.
Okay.
You can learn from it. And you could probably apply things here and there, but really it was targeted to people who are trying to build a product or service. Now you can use certain elements of it, but it wasn't specifically designed for that. Whereas Indistractable is for everyone. That's really about anyone who's struggling with distraction. How can you make an experience something that doesn't take you away from what you really want to do, away from your values? But you can certainly see how you could use, for example, variable rewards in your day-to-day life. One technique that I talk about in Indistractable is called temptation bundling. And temptation bundling is a technique developed by Katie Milkman. And what she espoused is that you can take something that's rewarding from one area of your life and use it as the variable reward for a different area of your life. So for example, I have a rule that I never read articles online. Okay, so if I'm online and I see an interesting article, I never read it on my desktop. I only read it when I send it to this app on my phone called Pocket, and Pocket has a text to voice function. And so my rule is I can only consume that content when I'm exercising. Why? Because now I took something that I didn't really want to do. I don't really want to go exercise. It's not that much fun. And the reward is that interesting content. And of course, and if it's good content, if it's a good podcast or a good article or whatever, it's going to have that variable reward. It's going to have the mystery of, well, what's the answer? What's the conclusion? And so I use that variable reward from one area of my life so that I'm not, scrolling on my desktop when I should be working. And instead, I only get to consume it while I'm exercising.
Yeah, got it, got it. Okay, so let's move on to Indistractable since we started talking about that. Let's go back to how do you define distraction and why are we always distracted? Is it just a human thing?
Yeah, it definitely is actually. And so that goes against what I think most people believe these days, which is, oh, it's this new phenomenon that somehow our phones created and social media created and the modern world created. And nothing could be further from the truth, because we know that 2,500 years ago, Plato, the Greek philosopher, was talking about distraction. He called it in the Greek akrasia, the tendency to do things against our better interests. And so the message I want people to understand is that distraction is nothing new. People have always struggled with distraction. And I think it's very unhealthy to think, oh, this evil technology is hijacking our brains and these awful algorithms from these big tech companies are making me do things. If you believe that, you believe exactly what the tech companies want you to believe. They want you to believe you're powerless, because when you believe there's nothing to do about a problem, what do? Nothing. And that's what they want. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm trying to tell people is that these companies are good, right? The techniques are good and they know how to get you hooked. And I know how they get you hooked. I wrote the book Hooked. I know all their tricks. Yeah. These techniques are good. They're not that good, right? You do have personal autonomy and agency if you believe you do. So the biggest thing you can do if you want to regain your focus is to believe you have power. If you believe you're powerless, it will be true. There's nothing you'll do about it. So that's the first step, is to believe in your own power and agency. Now, to do that, let's understand what is distraction, right? A lot of us we think we know what distraction is, or we think we know what the problem is, but we haven't really stopped to define it. So let's talk about distraction. The best way to understand what is distraction is to understand what is the opposite of distraction. If you ask most people what's the opposite of distraction, they'll tell you it's focus. But that's not exactly right. The opposite of distraction is traction. Of course it is. Think about the word traction and distraction. They're opposites. They both come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull, and they both end in the same 6-letter word, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action, reminding us that distraction is not something that happens to us. Right? We like to say, oh, my phone rang, or my kids interrupted me, or my boss needed me, that this happened to me and I got distracted. No, distraction is an action that pulls you towards something you didn't want to do. Okay, away from your intentions, away from your values, away from becoming the kind of person you want to become. That is an act of distraction. The opposite, traction, is any action that pulls you towards what you said you would do, things that you do with intent, things that move you closer to your values and help you become the kind of person you want to become. So now that we know the difference between traction and distraction, we can actually start getting a grip on it by understanding what is the difference. What is the difference between an act of traction and an act of distraction is one word. And that one word is intent. You see, as Dorothy Parker said, the time you plan to waste is not wasted time. So we need to stop moralizing and medicalizing these perfectly normal, fine behaviors. There's nothing wrong with going on social media. There's nothing wrong with listening to a podcast. There's nothing wrong with enjoying Netflix. Stop feeling guilty about it. Rather, do it on your schedule and according to your values, not someone else's, certainly not the tech companies.
Right. You're saying if you have the intention to be on social media or watch Netflix, it's totally fine because it's the intent. And
Exactly.
I love your definition of distraction and traction makes it about the person's action. Like, it's not the text that distracted me. It's my choice to do something after that trigger, right?
Right. Exactly.
People usually define distraction as something happened to me versus I am the one that did this after this happened to me. Like, I chose to respond in this way.
And as long as you've done that choice in advance, the problem, we'll get to why it's a problem when you do it in the moment. Let's actually get to that. So you've got traction, you've got distraction, right? Yep. Now you've got what we call our triggers. So think about traction pointing one way, distraction pointing the opposite way. Now we have what's called triggers. Triggers are these things that lead us towards traction and distraction. Yep. The usual suspects are what we call external triggers. External triggers are all these things outside of us, the pings, the dings, the rings, anything in our outside environment. Those are called external triggers. But studies have found, those only account for about 10% of our distractions. Only 10% of the time that you check your phone is it because of a ping, ding, or ring. What's the other 90%? The
You're
other
bored.
90% of the time that we check our devices, that we get distracted, it's not because of an external trigger, because of what we call an internal trigger. What is an internal trigger? An internal trigger is an uncomfortable emotional state that we seek to escape. Boredom,
So good. Yep.
loneliness, fatigue, uncertainty, anxiety. So if we don't understand that the root cause of distraction, it's not your devices, it's not that you have a broken brain, it's not that there's something wrong with you, it's not that you're a bad person, it's simply that you haven't learned how to deal with discomfort in a healthy way that leads you towards traction. So you try and escape it with
Yep.
distraction.
Yep.
But if you don't understand the root cause, whether it's too much news, too much booze, too much football, too much Facebook, you are always going to get distracted by something or another unless you understand the root cause of the problem is our inability to deal with discomfort.
Yeah.
And why are we unable to deal with discomfort? It's because we never learned. It's just a
Yep.
skill like any other. So we blame the device, we blame the things outside of ourselves when really it's just a skill. We just haven't learned how to deal with internal triggers.